I didn't start this investigation by looking for missing documents. I was looking for consistency. History, we are told, is a meticulous record of progress, a linear climb from the primitive to the industrial, documented with increasing precision as we approach the 20th century. But when you look at the global archives from the year 1901, the timeline doesn't just fray its severs. I found references to a geopolitical reality that simply shouldn't exist according to our modern textbooks. Maps from the mid-19th century still labeled vast swaths of northern Asia and North America, not as frontier or wilderness, but as Tartaria, a high-functioning, interconnected civilization with its own heraldry, its own trade routes, and a distinct architectural signature. Then, within a single generation, the references stop. The encyclopedias were reprinted, the census data was corrected, the genealogical records of entire regions were lost to convenient fires or administrative restructuring. We're told this was merely the natural consolidation of modern empires, but the physical evidence suggests a deliberate global erasure. Why did 1,000 years of cartography vanish in less than a decade? Why was the history of the world's largest landmass systematically overwritten at the dawn of the photographic age? The year 1901 stands as a silent sentry at the gates of the 20th century. To the casual observer, it was a year of Victorian optimism and the birth of the Edwardian era. A time when the old world was finally being digitized and categorized by the burgeoning sciences of archaeology and ethnography. Yet, if you spend enough time in the basement stacks of national libraries or scrolling through the digitized remnants of pre-1900 gazetteers, you begin to notice a profound structural shift in how human history was organized. Before 1901, the world was a sprawling, complicated tapestry of overlapping jurisdictions and great Tartaries that occupied the collective mind of every major cartographer in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. After 1901, that tapestry was replaced by a clean, sterilized narrative of nation-states that seemingly emerged from a vacuum. This wasn't a gradual transition of power, it was an evidentiary collapse. If we look at the 1783 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, Tartaria is described as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and west. It wasn't a vague ethnic descriptor. It was a recognized sovereign entity with distinct subregions: Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, and independent Tartary. By the late 1800s, these distinctions began to blur in official Western literature, and by the turn of the century, the name had been relegated to the status of a misnomer used by ignorant predecessors. This raises a fundamental problem for the serious historian. How does a geographic reality, spanning millions of square miles, documented for centuries by the likes of Mercator and Ortelius, simply become a linguistic error? The standard academic explanation is that Tartary was merely a broad European term for Central Asia, similar to how the Orient was used. But this explanation fails to account for the specificity of the archives that disappeared. In 1901, the Smithsonian Institution and various European counterparts underwent a massive recataloguing effort. It was during this period that thousands of artifacts, records of strange skeletal remains, and accounts of pre-Diluvian technology were moved into private collections or marked as unidentified. We see a similar pattern in the Russian imperial archives following the transition of power in the late 19th century. The genealogical records of the families that inhabited the Volga region and the Ural Mountains, the heart of what was once called Grand Tartaria, were systematically destroyed or altered to fit a new Romanov-centric history. Consider the Great Fire of 1,901 inches, Jacksonville, or the numerous accidental fires in administrative centers across the United States and Europe during this exact window. We are told these were the result of poor infrastructure and the volatility of early electrical systems. However, when you cross-reference the locations of these fires with the archives they contained, a pattern emerges. These weren't just buildings burning, these were the repositories of municipal records, land deeds, and architectural blueprints for structures that defy the known capabilities of the 19th century laborer. When the archives burned, the true history of these buildings burned with them. allowing the official narrative to claim they were built by horse and buggy societies in impossibly short time frames. The loss of these archives is particularly suspicious when one examines the star fort phenomenon. There are thousands of these geometrically perfect, technologically advanced fortifications scattered across every continent, from the Americas to the deepest reaches of Siberia. In the 1800s, many of these were still listed as active administrative or energetic hubs. By 1901, they were either being repurposed as prisons, buried under dirt to create parks, or their original blueprints were being scrubbed from the record. Why would a global civilization build identical, mathematically complex bastions that serve no logical defensive purpose against 19th century artillery, only to have the documentation for their construction vanish simultaneously across the globe? It makes one wonder if the information age actually began with a massive deletion. If you were to discover a map in your own attic from 1850 that showed a country where none currently exists, would you trust the map or the textbook that told you the map was a fantasy? I'm interested to know, have any of you encountered a family heirloom, an old map, or a localized historical account that directly contradicts the official timeline of your hometown? It seems the further we look into the private records that survive the 1901 purge, the more the official story begins to look like a carefully constructed facade. This purge wasn't limited to paper. It extended to the very people who carried the oral traditions of the old world. The late 1800s saw a sudden and aggressive push toward universal education, which, while framed as a humanitarian triumph, served to standardize history. In the United States, Russia, and the British colonies, indigenous and local histories were replaced with a centralized curriculum. The children of the 1890s were the first generation to be taught that Tartaria never existed. By the time they reached adulthood in the 1920s, the Grand Tartary of their grandparents' maps had become a fairy tale, a symptom of unscientific cartography. The most unsettling evidence of this disappearance, however, lies in the photographic record. Between 1860 and 1890, photography was a tool of raw documentation. The camera didn't know how to lie about scale, or the strange antique tech devices that adorn the rooftops of San Francisco, Moscow, and Peking. These photos show cities that were far more advanced and far more empty than they should have been. Then, around 1901, the pioneer narrative takes over. The photos become staged, the crowds become managed, and the towering spires that once dominated the skylines are either removed or rebranded as decorative flagpoles. The archives didn't just disappear, they were replaced by a new, more manageable reality. We are living in the shadow of a ghost civilization, standing in doorways built for someone else, reading a history book that was written only after the original witnesses were silenced. The silence of the archives is most profound when we look at the great exhibitions of the late 19th century. To the modern student of history, the World's Fair's Chicago in 1893, Sreet, Louis in 1904, Buffalo in 1901 were temporary celebrations of industrial progress. White cities built of plaster and wood to be burned or demolished once the crowds went home. But the photographic record from these years tells a different story. It shows massive Greco-Roman complexes, featuring domes that rivaled the Vatican, illuminated by millions of incandescent bulbs, at a time when the surrounding cities were still navigating muddy streets by candlelight. The official narrative claims these were staff and plaster constructions built in mere months by unskilled laborers. Yet, if you look at the foundations, the intricate masonry, and the sheer scale of the machinery housed within, the temporary explanation begins to feel like a convenient lie, designed to justify their destruction. Why would a civilization supposedly obsessed with progress and permanence build the most magnificent structures in human history, only to dynamite them months later? In 1901, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo featured the Tower of Light, a 375-foot structure that harnessed the power of Niagara Falls. The blueprints for the electrical distribution within these fairgrounds are notoriously difficult to find in public records today. They were managed by private consortiums and disappeared into corporate archives shortly after the fairs closed. This was a systematic decommissioning of technology that didn't fit the emerging fossil fuel paradigm. These fairs weren't expositions of new inventions. They were the final, public viewings of a Tartarian infrastructure that was being liquidated and rebranded. The architectural consistency of these fairs across the globe suggests a pre-existing, unified style that transcended national borders. From the 1880s to 1901, you could find the same beaux arts or neoclassical giants in San Francisco, Melbourne, and Paris. They all shared a specific feature: atmospheric energy collectors. Many of these buildings were topped with ornate metallic finials and antennas that the history books dismiss as decorative lightning rods. But when you look at the 1890s photographs of these structures, they are often glowing with an internal light that lacks the harsh flicker of early carbon filament bulbs. This was the era of Nikola Tesla and the realization that the ionosphere could be tapped for wireless power. If Tartaria was an empire built on this free, atmospheric energy, then the archives describing its distribution had to be destroyed to pave the way for a metered, controlled energy grid. Image showing the 1893 Chicago World's Fair at night. The year 1901 was the tipping point. It was the year J.P. Morgan famously pulled funding from Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower project upon realizing that if anyone can draw the power, we can't put a meter on it. This financial pivot matches the archival pivot. The records of atmospheric electricity, once discussed openly in scientific journals of the 1870s, were suddenly classified or ridiculed as pseudoscience by 1905. It's a classic case of retroactive continuity. By destroying the construction records and blueprints of the World's Fair buildings, the controllers of the 20th century could claim that free energy was a pipe dream. Rather than a recovered reality from a civilization they were in the process of dismantling. This leads us to the concept of the Great Reset of the 19th century. If you look at the census data from major cities in the 1880s, there is a recurring anomaly: the foundling crisis. Tens of thousands of children were being shipped across the United States and Europe on orphan trains, destined for rural outposts or industrial labor. Where did these children come from? The official records cite poverty and disease, yet the mortality rates for adults don't match the sheer volume of abandoned youth. It appears as though an entire generation was separated from its heritage, its history, and its archives. If you wanted to erase Tartaria, you wouldn't just burn the books. You would ensure the next generation had no one to tell them who their grandfathers really were. The architecture we see in the 1901 photographs, the grand post offices, the massive courthouses, the asylums that looked like palaces, were the inheritance of these orphans. They were told these buildings were newly constructed by their glorious leaders, even as they sat in rooms with 2 0-foot ceilings and windows that seemed designed for a different atmosphere. I've often wondered, if you were raised in a world where the buildings were already there, and the adults told you they were built just for show, would you have the courage to question the physical reality in front of your eyes? Does your own city have a building that feels inherited rather than built? Perhaps a local landmark with a basement that seems to go deeper than the official plans suggest? In the Russian archives, this era is marked by the re-education of the Siberian territories. Following the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway in the late 1890s, the Russian Empire began a massive campaign of internal colonization. They weren't just moving people, they were moving history. The old maps of the Tartarian desert were replaced by maps of Siberian governors, and the ancient stone cities that travelers had described for centuries were either demolished for their stone, repurposed as military outposts. The archives of these cities, their trade agreements with the East, their unique legal codes, their scientific achievements simply ceased to be referenced in the official Russian state papers after 1901. What we are witnessing is the shuffling of the deck. The artifacts were moved, the people were displaced, and the records were burned. The world of 1902 was functionally the same world as 1899, but its memory had been wiped clean. The transition from a Tartarian world of free energy and grand architecture to a modern world of coal, oil, and cramped housing was masked by the smoke of 100 convenient fires. The buildings that remained were stripped of their functional technology and renamed classical revivals, leaving us to wonder why our ancestors, who supposedly traveled by horse, had such an obsession with building for giants. The truth isn't hidden in what was built, but in what was meticulously removed from the record once the construction was complete. The transition of power from the old world to the new required more than just the destruction of paper. It required the physical modification of the earth itself. As we move past 1901, we encounter the strange phenomenon of the mud flood, a term used by modern researchers to describe the thousands of buildings globally that appear to have their original first floors buried deep, underground. Mainstream geology and architecture call these light wells, or raised street levels, necessitated by drainage issues. Yet, when you examine the excavation photographs from the early 1900s, you see perfectly formed arched windows and grand entryways being unearthed, 10, 15, even 20 feet below the current pavement. These aren't basements. They are the sophisticated ground floors of a civilization that was partially submerged by a cataclysmic event that the official archives of 1901 simply refuse to acknowledge. If a global event, be it a tectonic shift, a localized liquefaction, or a massive environmental upheaval occurred in the mid-1800s, the archives would have been the first thing the new administrators sought to control. By 1901, the cleanup was reaching its zenith. This was the era of the Great Dig. Cities like Chicago, Seattle, and Atlanta famously raised their street levels, supposedly jacking up entire blocks of stone buildings to install modern sewers. But the logistics described in the newspapers of the time border on the miraculous. We are told that men with hand cranks and literal timber jacks lifted tens of thousands of tons of masonry without cracking a single pane of glass. It is far more likely that these cities were being dug out, and the raising was a cover story to explain why the grandest architecture on the continent was half buried in silt. The archives of the 19th century patent offices offer another glimpse into what was being suppressed during this transition. Before the turn of the century, patents for wireless telegraphy, cold light bulbs, and self-propelling vehicles were common. By 1901, the patent system became a gatekeeper rather than an accelerator. Technologies that utilized the natural resonance of the Earth, the very energy Tartaria likely used to power its star forts, and illuminated cities were bought up by emerging monopolies and shelved. The records of these patents often list national security or lack of commercial viability as reasons for their disappearance. In reality, these technologies were the fingerprints of the Tartarian infrastructure, and they had to be removed to ensure the world remained dependent on the newly established oil and coal grids. This brings us to the curious case of the silent cities of the American West. In the late 1800s, explorers and surveyors frequently reported finding massive stone ruins in the deserts of Arizona, Colorado, and Nevada ruins that did not fit the nomadic profile of the indigenous tribes. These reports were published in local journals and early bulletins of the Bureau of Ethnology. However, after the reorganization of the Smithsonian in the early 1900s, these sites were either closed to the public, designated as natural formations, or attributed to much later, less advanced cultures. The archives detailing the precise measurements and anomalous artifacts found at these sites were moved to restricted status. We see this same pattern in the heart of the old Tartarian Empire. In 1901, the Russian Geographical Society began standardizing the history of the Urals. Ancient canal systems that stretched for hundreds of miles, canals so straight and precise they could only have been mapped from the air, were scrubbed from the new maps or labeled as natural river bypasses. The archives of the local Cossack hosts, who had lived among these ruins for centuries and maintained the oral history of the great kings of the north, were confiscated and replaced with official imperial histories. I've often wondered if the Wild West, or the Siberian frontier, were actually post-apocalyptic landscapes rather than untamed wilderness. Have you ever looked at a local historical building and noticed that the basement windows are actually the tops of full-sized arches? If you've seen this in your own town, it might be the only archive left that hasn't been burned or redacted. The physical evidence is still there, beneath our feet, waiting for the official narrative to finally collapse under its own weight. The archives of 1901 didn't just disappear. They were buried under the very streets we walk on today, hidden in plain sight by a world that decided it was easier to invent a new history than to explain the old one. The systematic deconstruction of the Tartarian narrative required more than just the burying of its foundations. It required the redirection of the human eye. By 1901, a new phenomenon began to dominate the architectural world: the Restoration movement. Under the guise of preservation, historical societies across Europe and the Americas began stripping the original features from municipal buildings. Ornate copper domework, complex crystalline finials, and the strange, metallic mercury red paint that adorned the spires of the 1800s were replaced with inert stone and gray lead. The archives detailing the functional purpose of these materials, specifically their conductive properties, were reclassified as aesthetic maintenance records, and then largely discarded during the major administrative shifts of the early 20th century. If you look at the Great Siberian Census of 1897, the last major demographic study before the 1901 archival pivot, the data reveals a population density in northern Asia that the later frontier narrative simply cannot explain. There were cities listed with thousands of stone dwellings that by 1910 were marked on maps as abandoned ruins or nomadic seasonal camps. This wasn't a slow decline, it was a ghost mapping. The archives of the Russian Imperial Geographical Society from this period contain field notes from explorers who describe cities of light in the middle of the taiga settlements with paved streets, automated water systems. Yet, when the official volumes were published after 1901, these descriptions were scrubbed, replaced by vague references to geological anomalies or ancient tribal mounds. Image: a comparison of an 1880s map versus a 1910 map of the same Siberian region. The suppression extended deep into the educational archives of the time. In 1901, the General Education Board was established in the United States, funded by the very industrialists who were consolidating the new energy and steel monopolies. This board oversaw a massive standardization of history textbooks. The goal was to create a labor force that viewed the past as a primitive struggle, ensuring they would never look at the grand architecture of their own cities and recognize it as a superior technology. The archives of the classical schools, which had taught the principles of sacred geometry and atmospheric resonance, were shuttered. The teachers were replaced, and the curriculum was shifted toward the industrial model, where history began with the steam engine and ended with the internal combustion motor. The most chilling evidence of this erasure can be found in the asylum records of the early 1900s. Across the world, from the massive Trans-Allegheny in West Virginia to the sprawling stone complexes of Russia and Australia, thousands of people were institutionalized during this archival reset. Many of these individuals were the last keepers of the old world knowledge, the engineers who maintained the atmospheric collectors, the navigators of the old canal systems, and the scholars of the Tartarian languages. Their testimonies were dismissed as delusions of grandeur or neurasthenia. By 1901, the legal frameworks for civil commitment were expanded, allowing the state to sequester anyone whose memory of the past didn't align with the new official timeline. Their personal papers, diaries, and family Bibles were routinely confiscated and burned upon admission. I've often wondered about the great library fires that seemed to plague the turn of the century. Was it truly a coincidence that the library of the University of Turin, containing thousands of Oriental and Tartar manuscripts, burned in 1904? Or that the San Francisco archives, which held the true construction records of the Pacific Coast's impossible architecture, were lost in the fires of 1906? It seems that whenever the physical evidence became too difficult to explain, a fire provided the perfect administrative reset. Have you ever noticed that your local historical society's records for a major downtown building only seem to begin after a major fire or renovation? This is the signature of a managed history, a timeline that starts only after the inconvenient parts have been turned to ash. The 1901 archival purge was the final nail in the coffin of a global consciousness. It was the year the old world was officially declared dead, and its remaining inhabitants were told they were the first modern humans. The star forts became military relics, the atmospheric towers became monuments, and the vast territory of Tartaria became a myth of the cartographers. But for those who know how to read the silence between the records, the archives didn't just vanish, they left a vacuum. We are standing in that vacuum today, looking at the grand doorways and the buried windows, realizing that the people who built them didn't just go away. They were written out of the story by the very people who inherited their world. The final erasure of Tartaria was not completed with fire or the burial of stone, but through the redefinition of time itself. By the end of 1901, the international dateline and the standardization of global time zones had been fully integrated into the world's administrative systems. This wasn't just a convenience for the shipping industry, it was a synchronization of the global narrative. Before this period, local time and local history were tethered to the land and the stars. After 1901, every archive, every telegram, and every birth certificate was funneled through a centralized, standardized clock. This temporal reset allowed the new historians to fix the dates of construction for buildings that had stood for centuries, retroactively assigning them to the Victorian era or the industrial boom of the 1880s. We must look at the great repurposing that followed. Between 1901 and 1914, thousands of Tartarian structures were converted into museums, government offices, or, most tellingly, mental asylums and prisons. The very buildings that once functioned as nodes for free energy and communal administration were turned into tools of confinement. The archives of these conversions are filled with modernization receipts, lists of removals of unnecessary copper wiring, the stripping of metallic roof tiles, and the capping of decorative wells that reached hundreds of feet into the earth. If you look at the floor plans of these buildings today, there are always void spaces, walled-off corridors, and chambers that the modern blueprints simply label as structural fill. These are the physical remains of a suppressed technology hidden behind drywall and bureaucracy. The most profound loss, however, occurred in the private sector. In the early 1900s, the inheritance laws across Europe and America were drastically overhauled. If a family possessed records, maps, or artifacts that contradicted the new state-sanctioned history, the legal hurdles to keeping those private archives became insurmountable. Tax audits, property seizures, and public safety inspections were used to flush out the remnants of the old world's knowledge. The families of the former guardian class, the overseers who likely lived in the oversized estates we now call Gilded Age mansions, were either brought into the new financial fold or saw their pracket dungeons, legacies systematically dismantled. Their personal libraries were bought by the very foundations that were currently rewriting the textbooks. What remains today is a world of architectural amnesia. We walk past post offices in small-town America that look like Roman temples, and we are told they were built in 1902 by a local architect who had never been to Europe. We see the star forts of Florida and the antique tech spires of Russia, and we accept the label of decorative or obsolete. But the archives didn't disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because they were dangerous. They proved that humanity once lived in a world of abundance, utilizing the very energy of the atmosphere, governed by a logic that didn't require the scarcity and control of the 20th century. The year 1901 was the door closing on that reality. The archives were the keys, and they were melted down to forge the chains of our current understanding. But as the light wells of our cities continue to reveal buried arches, and as the old maps resurface in the digital cracks of the internet, the silence of the archives is becoming a scream. We are no longer looking for giants or ghosts. We are looking for ourselves, the version of humanity that knew how to build with the earth rather than against it. The question is no longer, why did the archives disappear? But rather, what will we do with the truth they left behind? Because while you can burn the paper and bury the stone, You cannot erase the resonance of a civilization that was built into the very frequency of the world. The architecture is still here, the energy is still here, and now the memory is returning. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.